Mr Simon Coveney was asked about the Brexit negotiations this morning. Let's take a look and see what he had to say.
What the British government has been asking of the Irish government is just trust us, we'll solve these issues with a broad, bold trade agreement.
Can I play you
that may or may not
clip?
be possible,
Can
we
I
don't
play
know.
You
but we
clip?
can't,
Sorry to interrupt
asked,
you.
just to finish the point,
yeah.
John.
Yep, carry on.
Sorry, I mean, we can't be asked here to leap into the dark.
Well, Parliament's Brexit Committee has a report out today on how the negotiations have been going. It says the committee can't see how it will be possible to resolve the issue of having no border between Northern Ireland and the Republic with the government's policy of leaving the single market and customs union. The chair of that committee, Labour's Hilary Benn MP, is in Central Lobby and joins us now. Mr Benn, thank you very much indeed. Good afternoon. Thanks for being with us. You say in your report that the proposals for the border are untested. But isn't that the whole point of them, that we are in uncharted territory and therefore we're not going to know how we're going to solve this?
Well, we certainly are in uncharted territory because of the referendum result. But the decision to leave the customs union and the single market is not an inevitable consequence of the result. It is a choice which the government has made. And what we have said in the report today is that, on the one hand, the government's objective is that there should be no border, no institutional arrangements, no infrastructure, and we support that, the Irish government support that, everybody supports that, but we don't see at the moment how you can possibly reconcile that with the other decision the government has made about leaving the customs union and the single market, and therefore we have called on the government to set out in more detail how it proposes to square that circle, because what it published in the summer talking about technology or a new customs partnership was itself, in the government's own words, they recognise that this is untested, and clearly it has thus far not been sufficient to provide reassurance to the Irish government about what's going to happen.
What do you actually propose? What are your solid proposals of how to take this this very, very complicated position where the two sides seem very, very far apart? What do you suggest for taking this forward?
Well, the Select Committee has not proposed a solution. We have just identified the continuing nature
what would you suggest?
Of the problem. The Select Committee hasn't reached a view on that. Personally, speaking as a Labour politician, I would certainly stay in the customs union, but that is not a conclusion that the Select Committee has reached. It is for the British government, fundamentally, to set out how this is going to work. The Select Committee has also said today, we want to see the negotiations move on to phase 2, because that may help to provide part of the answer to this question, depending on our future trading relationship. And we want the government to set out clearly, assuming the European Council gives the go-ahead, what seeking a deep and special partnership actually means, because Michel Barnier is going to be asking them very quickly, OK, so what do you want? Okay. And Parliament needs to know what the government's plan is.
There are lots of rather well-sourced reports earlier in the week suggesting that actually the mood in Dublin was that a lot of progress has been made on this issue. So isn't your Select Committee report essentially just 48 hours late? Aren't you quite seriously behind the curve?
No, we produced our report on the basis of the information available to us at the time we finalised it. But look, if progress is being made, well then I'm certain the Select Committee would welcome that, because we also say in the report we want to move on to phase 2 of the negotiations. Of course, some things are going to move quite quickly, particularly when you have a deadline coming up. But this is clearly a fundamental problem. The government has recognised that. The Irish government has recognised that. And what the Irish government's been saying in recent weeks has indicated they weren't at that point satisfied that a solution could be found. I hope very much that one can be, that gets us through to phase 2, but I don't think we'll see the final answer on the border until the negotiations are completed.
Has the intervention of Leo Varadkar, the Irish Taoiseach, actually helped progress this argument, helped bring a solution slightly closer? Because critics of his would say he's being intransigent and he's presented a problem. So has he presented you with a problem?
Look, the Irish government is looking after Ireland's interests. Everybody wants to solve this problem, but it's a problem that's been put on the Republic of Ireland by the referendum result and by the government's decision to leave the customs union and the single market. That is why there is a difficulty. Now, Ireland is particularly affected by Brexit for reasons that you will well understand, and therefore it's entirely appropriate that the Taoiseach should say we need to look after the interests of Ireland. In the end, we have to reach an agreement not just between the UK and Ireland because Ireland is part of the 27. And the issue about the border is when we leave the European Union, this will be the external border of the 27 member states, as it is in all of the other countries. And that is why trying to find a solution, given the context, given the Good Friday Agreement, given the fact that there are 200 crossings with no border posts, no checking at the moment, which is one of the practical benefits of the Good Friday Agreement, it's really important that we hang on to that, but we have to find a practical way forward. And that's why today we've called on the government to set out in more detail how it's going to solve it, because what it's offered thus far hasn't persuaded the Irish government or the Select Committee that you could square the circle.
OK, well, your fellow Select Committee member, Jacob Rees-Mogg, who's sat beside me in the studio, tweeted this morning, today's report by the Select Committee on exiting the European Union split between those who voted Remain and those who voted Leave. This explains its Remonerish tinge. Why is he wrong?
Well, I must say, Remonerish tinge, that's a new one on me. Well done, Jacob, for coming up with that. Look, the vast majority of the report that we've published today was agreed by consensus. And we worked very hard in the committees, I'm sure Jacob will attest to try and reach consensus. You look at the back of the report, you can see which sections there were votes on. And in the end, each member of the committee, as an individual, decides how they're going to cast their vote. We've got a job of work to do as a committee to hold the government to account, to scrutinise the process of Brexit and to offer our opinion and our recommendations. In the past, we have said there should be a vote for MPs. The government eventually agreed to that. We called for transitional arrangements. The government is now seeking those. We asked for a white paper on the government's negotiating objectives. That was eventually given. So the committee is seeking to have an influence on the process, and we work together as members despite the different views we held during the course of the referendum last year.
OK, Mr Benn, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
That's Hilary Benn in Central Lobby. Mr Rees-Mogg, thanks for coming in.
It's a pleasure, thank you.
You're an optimist on matters Brexit. What's your solution?
OK, first of all, can I agree with the last point that Mr Benn was saying, that he is a really good and patient chairman, and there are areas of agreement, and we do our best to agree. But the highlight of the report is inevitably the issues where we don't agree, which divided straight down the lines of how you voted in the referendum.
And predictably so, yeah.
And predictably so. And Select Committee reports are powerful when they're unanimous. When they're not unanimous, it's just straight party politics or Brexit politics.
Let's talk about Ireland.
But let's come to your
solution?
question. The solution was set out yesterday very clearly by the head of HMRC, by John Thompson, who appeared, actually day before yesterday, in front of the Brexit Select Committee. And he said that he could implement the government's policy of not having any border, that it was all completely manageable, and if a border was to be imposed, that was a matter for the Irish government and for the European Union. There is no need for any border in terms of UK government policy, and essentially it's up to the Republic of Ireland and the European Union to decide if they want to impose one.
Do you have confidence that some of the proposed technical solutions for custom checks and so on, which lots of people say there's no need for, there can be a frictionless border. Lots of people say, well, there's technological solutions. Are you confident that they're actually going to work? Because there are feelings in Dublin that they could actually be a gift to insurgents.
Well, I think most of it's very straightforward. You can do the customs declarations in the same way that you do VAT declarations, that a transition becomes a tax point rather than a checkpoint. And people pay their VAT by sending in a quarterly return. There is an exemption of £85,000 for VAT when you don't have to do this. The government has suggested the exemption for customs should be £250,000, and then it's a question of whether people pay their taxes or not. So that solution is very straightforward. Non-tariff barriers, well, some things already take place on an all-Ireland basis already. So animal hygiene is on an all-Ireland basis already. There's no need to break that up. So yes, I think the technological solutions are there. And from a UK point of view, we do not want to put tariffs on anybody. That free trade is the real opportunity of Brexit, so we shouldn't be looking to collect vast customs revenues.
Was it, the DUP are the kingmakers of this parliament, was it counterproductive of the DUP to say and to threaten that they would remove their confidence and supply agreement if this wasn't solved?
Well, I think the issue the DUP has correctly raised is that we cannot have a situation where Northern Ireland is taken away from the United Kingdom. Northern Ireland is much a part of the United Kingdom as Somerset is, and that is the position of Conservatives and Unionists.
But was it damaging to this government and its wider agenda that the confidence supply agreement that we've got could potentially be undermined by the DUP saying that this issue is not one that's being resolved to our satisfaction.
This is a Conservative and Unionist party that is the main party of government. The Unionist bit is essential. There is no majority within the Conservative Party, let alone in the DUP, to break up the United Kingdom to meet the requirements of the Prime Minister of Ireland. So I think what the DUP has said is pretty standard Conservative policy.
OK, Tim, based on what we've seen so far of how Brexit negotiations are progressing, are the negotiators that Britain has got good enough, up to the job of finding a solution on this vexed issue?
I think the negotiations are very hard because I think what they've revealed more than anything else is how fragile and insecure an organisation the European Union is. A confident institution wouldn't be so niggardly and difficult in these negotiations, but it is so worried about losing other members, it is having to be so difficult with the UK. And the Irish border issue, it's much easier to solve this issue if the trade talks were happening concurrently with the other issues. But because the European Union is so obsessed with this money issue, because the budget position of the EU is so weak, we are being put into these very difficult positions where, frankly, the Irish government is playing politics. Sinn Féin is trying to run a very hard line on this issue, and the Prime Minister of Ireland is feeling that he has to play that game too. And that, for me, is the principal lesson I think we have to take from this. I think this can be solved, but there's every possibility that towards the end of this negotiations, one country, remember how Wallonia almost held the EU-Canada agreement to ransom. There's a possibility that one country in the EU could do that again. We have to prepare for no deal. Even if we don't want it, because there is that possibility at the last minute that we will have to accept that outcome.
You're flanked by optimists on all sides. This sounds like it's going to be straightforward. Do you share the optimism of Tim and Jacob?
I don't share the optimism about the idea of a deal if you want to stay outside the customs union. I do think there is a very simple solution, which is stay in the customs union. That is something I just do not believe that Leave voters in the country believe in. They voted on the basis that they wanted to unlock this wonderful potential of trade deals, which is the obsession of the right of the Conservative Party. I think they voted on economics and immigration.
Economic growth, though, is outside of the European Union.
Equally
Helen.
well, it is the biggest trading bloc that is right next to us, whereas Australia is quite far away.
Well,
but this is the point, is that I just don't... I think this is one of these situations. I think people in Britain would probably think, why are we having this enormous row about something that is an obsession for the Tory party and no one else really cares about?
Jacob, this is, I mean, a charge that you've had to... it's been levelled at you repeatedly over the last few years. Is the obsession of a particular wing of the Tory party, particularly on an issue such as the customs union, impeding the finding of a really quite easy and pragmatic solution?
The customs union is a protectionist racket that protects continental European businesses at the cost of British consumers. It puts up the price of food, of clothing, of footwear. These hit the poorest in our country the most because the largest portion of their spending goes on food, clothing and footwear compared to the richer in society.
And the poorest people of the world.
And
in
the poorest
Africa.
people in the world. That's absolutely right,
places.
because it discriminates against imports from some of the poorest countries in the world. So it impoverishes poor countries at the expense of our poorest consumers. To get out of the customs union is the great advantage of Brexit. It will be very good for people in this country, but it will also help some very poor countries elsewhere in the world. The customs union is a real disgrace and a blot on the reputation of the European Union, if it's got a reputation.
Well, I think that the idea that the World Trade Organisation is a sort of munificent kind of, charitable organisation, whereas the EU is grasping and nationalist, is a very strange way of putting this. I mean, I do think that it is something that I just do not think is in the mind of most Leave voters. This is what I think is fascinating. If you think, and I know you hear a lot about, we need to respect the results of the referendum, we also need to be really interested in what drove the referendum. And I think that was economics and immigration. I do not think it was free trade.
Okay. Cheaper food's a pretty attractive thing for most people in this country. Cheaper clothing and cheaper footwear, likewise.
But if we fall out of the WTO terms, we will not have that.
Yes, we will, because
here,
we set our own tariffs. Just a moment, because it's really important. In the WTO, you register your tariffs with the WTO. We could put 0 on food, 0 on clothing, 0 on footwear, and that would be a decision of the British government.
Okay, I tell you what, we'll get you guys together to talk about the customs union at another point.